phylum is massive. In fact, for most of you, this is probably what you wish you had been working on all semester. Right? Not that you haven't fallen in love with all the cool little protists and fungi and plants, but probably most of you would rather be studying these. These are the animals that you know the best. These are the animals that are most closely related to you and that include things like you, right? You're in this phylum. So this is probably where most of you want to be all along. And as you see in a course that's a survey course of biological diversity, these guys only get a day in a lab. But we will spend some time on the next week too, because you'll see a lot, most of the animals you'll see at Moog, you'll see a lot of invertebrate animals too, but you'll also see a lot of fish that fall into this group. Okay, so, and some penguins. Do they still have penguins? I think they still have penguins. Right? I started with this just a little bit last time, right? So the phyla that you're responsible for, of all the animal phyla, right, are Porifera, Nidaria, Ctenophora, Platyhelminthes, Annelida, Mollusca, Nematoda, Arthropoda, Chynodermata, and Chordata. Hopefully as I spewed off all those names, there's a picture in your head, right? Are you getting pictures in your head? You're catching name, some kind of an animal to each one of this plethora of names. You see there's going to be a whole bunch more names right now. I had mentioned last time that the sort of hallmark features for chordates is this idea of notochord, nerve cord, gill slits, and a tail. So a notochord is that thin, flexible rod that runs along the dorsal side of a chordate, and in a vertebrate chordate it develops into the backbone, right, or the vertebral column. They also have a dorsal nerve cord, this idea that what in them is dorsal is probably ventral in other animals. Remember, most invertebrates like arthropods and annelids and mollusks and things like that have a ventral nerve cord, and they tend to have a dorsal circulatory system. We have it kind of the other way around. Chordates have the nervous part is dorsal and the circulatory part is ventral. So this whole idea of dorsal-ventral axis inversion, that at some point the base of chordates, what was ventral became dorsal and what was dorsal became ventral. So this idea of dorsal-ventral axis inversion is a derived condition for them. So a dorsal nerve cord, and in vertebrate animals this becomes, of course, their spinal cord, right? And then this idea of having pharyngeal gills, this is your pharynx, right, the part of your throat that's common to both food and air. Having gill slits in the pharynx, that's unique, right? You didn't see that in any arthropod or any mollusk, right, or any annelid. There was nothing that had gills in its throat, right? This is a chordate feature. And then also this idea of having a tail, right? None of the animals we looked at so far had tails, right? So, like a jellyfish doesn't have a tail, a sea anemone doesn't have a tail, flatworm doesn't really have a tail, it has a posterior end, you can really call it a tail, right? This idea of a muscular post-anal tail is unique to chordates. So these four characters of a notochord, nerve cord, gill slits, and a tail really define chordates as a group. And all of these other things, and these are general characters for all deuterostome animals, right? Segmentation's not unique. Flexors and extensors we saw in arthropods, segmentation too. And having separate sexes is not particularly unique. Things like nematodes are mostly separate sexes, and so are arthropods. So a hypothetical ancestral chordate, what would the last common ancestor of all chordates have looked like? I don't know, maybe something like this. You'll notice that it has those four hallmark features, right, of a nerve cord, a notochord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a muscular post-anal tail. So it has the defining characters that we associate with a chordate. I mentioned to you last time that the traditional classes in chordata are disasters, right, because you have these groups like agnathans. Anybody happen to remember who those are? Jawless fish, that's not monophyletic. This group Ospictes, which are the bony fish, is not monophyletic. This group of Sarcopterygiae, the lobed fin bony fish, is not monophyletic. You've got this problem of having the class Aves is actually a part of the class Reptilia. You can't have a class inside a class. This class has historically 16 orders, 4 of which are extant, right? So you have the order Chelonia, which are what? Turtles and tortoises. Squamates, which are snakes and lizards. Crocodilians, which would be crocodiles and alligators. And this weird little order called Brachycephalia that has this strange little animal called a tuatara. The other 12 orders of reptiles were all dinosaurs and things that are extinct, right? Well, birds has its own 27 orders, so how's that supposed to work exactly? If this is actually a derived group inside of reptiles, right? So you have this big problem of reptiles being paraphyletic with respect to birds. Then you've got mammals down here at the bottom. So there's some clear problems in this. Our current phylogeny for chordates that we're working with is something more like this. And you'll see that now some of these groups kind of come through here still, like cephalochordates and urochordates. Vixenia and Pentromyzontida together would have been agnathans, so that's, notice agnatha doesn't appear on here. Chondrichthyes is here. You'll notice that Ostichthyes is still here, the bony fish, but that would have historically been these three together. What they've done now is decided, well, you know what, we're just going to call everything here Osteichthyes, and then that makes it monophyletic. The problem is, all of a sudden, that means that every reptile, bird, and mammal, and amphibian, is a bony fish, right? Probably when you walked in the door, if I said name a bony fish, you wouldn't have said like owl or something like that, right? You probably don't think of an owl as a fish, but from a phylogenetic point of view, it is. In fact, they're lumping it now together in this group Osteichthyes in order to make it monophyletic. And then, of course, birds you don't really even see on here at all, except as a group inside of reptiles. So it's a very different kind of a system than the way that these were historically defined. I also mentioned last time that now we have all these newly recognized nested monophyletic groups that we would like to apply names to. So for example, I might want to give a name to everybody, like right here, from the Chondrichthyans down to the mammals. This is a monophyletic group. Here's presumably the last common ancestor that they all shared. That individual is defined as having jaws. Everybody here has jaws. Nobody up there has jaws, right? So I could define that group as the jawed ones, and in fact there's a name for it. It's gnathostomes. So gnathostomes is a group inside of chordates, all the chordates that have jaws. I could also have a group down here, for example, that have a pectoral and a pelvic girdle, right, that have basically 4 limbs, 2 forelimbs and 2 hind limbs, right? Those would be the guys with legs, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And I could call them tetrapods. What does that mean? 4 limbs, right? And so I might want to have that as a name and be able to talk about this group, which is a good phylogenetic group, and I want to apply that name tetrapod for that. I also could have this name vertebrates, notice, so everybody from Tetromyzontida down to mammals all have a vertebral column. They have a notochord that develops into a vertebral column. Myxini do not. Urochordates and cephalochordates do not. They're chordates, but they're not vertebrate chordates. You all realize that vertebrates is a real group, right? Vertebrates is this. Here's the last common ancestor of all vertebrates, right? Invertebrates is just everybody who's not that. So invertebrate is not a real group, right? It includes, these are technically invertebrate chordates, right? And then you have all of the echinoderms and the platyhelminths and annelids and mollusks, and everybody else are all invertebrates too. Invertebrates is not a real group, vertebrates is. So you can see how we have all these different nested monophyletic groups and we want to apply these names. The problem starts to come with when we're going to try to use the Linnaean system. In Linnaeus' system, Chordata was a phylum inside of the animal kingdom. And most of these groups, like mammals and reptiles and amphibians and even things like maybe urochordates and cephalochordates and chondrichthyans, these were all classes. So if you think about how Linnaeus' ranks work, there's kingdom, phylum, class, right? So then the question would be, how would I label a group like craniates or vertebrates or gnathostomes if they're between phylum and class? So what most people have done, because there's so few Linnaean ranks, because Linnaeus developed a system like 300 years ago when there was 1,000 known species or something, it worked pretty well then. It doesn't work too well now. And obviously they didn't use any kind of phylogenetics with respect to classification. So it was a very simple system, and yet we're still kind of stuck with it. So you'll notice you kind of want to go maybe something like chordates, and then you could have the subphylum craniates, right? And then you could have a subphylum vertebrates, and then a subphylum gnathostomes, and then a subphylum Osteichthyes, and then a subphylum lobe fins. Most people don't want to do that, right? Somehow they want to be able to talk about these groups and put them between phylum and class, but they don't want to start to assign ranks to these. So I think if you go like to Wikipedia or something, you look at like how a turtle is classified, it'll say something like phylum Chordata, and then it'll say unranked craniates, unranked vertebrates, unranked gnathostome, unranked Osteichthyes, unranked lobe fins, unranked tetrapods, unranked amniotes, class reptilian, or something like that. So that when it's convenient to use a Linnaean rank, they'll use it. And when it's not, they just say unranked, 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 unranked. So they'll use the names, but they won't try to assign them an official Linnaean rank. They won't call them sub-file or something, just because it's not practical.
You mentioned that invertebrates are not a monophyletic group. Is it because it's describing a feature that a group doesn't have?
It's likely ancestral, right.
Okay.
It's describing a non-feature, which typically represents the ancestral condition. Okay. Probably not having a vertebral column is the ancestral condition for all animals, right? Having a vertebral column is a derived condition for one small group of animals. These guys right here. Yeah?
Okay.
The symplecomorphy. Goes right back to what we've been doing all semester. You can't define a group based on symplecomorphy. Invertebrates are defined by a symplecomorphic trait. Vertebrates are defined by a synapomorphic
Okay.
It uses synapomorph because it's defining a monophyletic group. It's a character that presumably evolved on the branch leading to the last common ancestor of that group. But not having a vertebral column, that's going to be way back at the base of all animals. That would have been the ancestral condition for all animals. So all the animals that share that ancestral condition are not going to be, not constitute a monophyletic group.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so are you kind of gathering the idea? So I'm not going to really apply ranks to these. I've asked that before in an exam. I've said, why does Linnaeus' hierarchical ranking system not work very well for chordates? The short answer is there are a whole bunch of newly identified nested monophyletic groups that we want to apply names to, and there are just way too few ranks to accommodate them. There's only 6, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, right? That's really it. So, I mean, you're looking here at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that we want to tuck in between phylum and class, right? There just are way too few Linnaean ranks to accommodate all these newly recognized nested monophyletic groups. The other kind of problem here is that you have to realize this historically was a class. This actually was a subclass, you know, and these kind of almost didn't even exist because these together would have been in the sort of this subclass of Sarcopterygii. So it's just, it's a mess. It's a mess. Not to mention the fact that you had a class here that was inside of another class. That doesn't work, right? So those, in the nutshell, it's kind of a mess, right? Y'all understand it's a mess? This is the way Campbell sort of lays it out in a little table. And you'll see up there, what word do they use over these names of Cephalochordata, Urochordata, Myxini, Petromyzontida, Chondrichthyes, and everything? What word do they use at the top there? Clade. Do you know what the word clade means? It means monophyletic group. They might as well have written the word group up there. The only emphasis, or the only legitimacy of the word clade over the word group is that it implies that it's monophyletic, but that's it. They're not willing to say whether it's a class, whether it's a subclass, whether it's a subphylum, whether it's a superphylum, who knows, right? They're not willing to apply any rank to it at all. I would say that you can, if you want to treat Chordata as a phylum, you could argue that these are classes. And certainly, historically, things like mammals, reptiles, amphibians, Chondrichthyans, those were recognized as classes. Most of those were recognized as classes. Some of them are new, though, so that they really weren't ever recognized as anything. Yeah. And notice out here, they're trying to show some of these other names that we have that would fall between phylum and clade, or whatever that thing is, that name over there. I would rather you not worry so much about the ranks here, so I'm not going to ask you to name the class and expect you to come up with Actinopterygii or something like that. Instead, I'd rather you just know these names and be able to attach animals to them. So here we go, ready? We're going to just go right down that list. We're going to go, what is a cephalochordate, what's a urochordate, what's Myxini, what's Petromyzontida, and hopefully, in the other class, I got right down to about here. I'm hoping I get all the way almost to the end with you guys. So cephalochordates. So chordata would be the phylum, they're cephalochordates. The common name for these animals are lancelets. We have prepared slides upstairs that have whole lancelets. They're about this big, and they're mounted under a little cover slip so that you can look at them. Very simple little animal. It almost looks like a little fish, except you might notice that it has no head. There's no head. This is the notochord, right? So it has the 4 characteristics of a chordate. It has a notochord, it has a dorsal nerve cord, it has pharyngeal gill slits and a tail, and this is the adult animal, so it retains all 4 chordate features into adulthood. Remember, a lot of chordates, like for example, you don't have pharyngeal gills anymore. You don't really have a tail anymore, right? You've lost a couple of those, but the rule is you just have to have them at some point in your life history. This thing actually retains them right on into adulthood. You'll notice that the notochord here, in most animals, their notochord stops, right? And there's or like your vertebral column stops here so that you can have a head, so you can have a cranium. This thing has no head. The notochord extends right to the very anterior tip of the animal. That's where this name, cephalo, right, refers to head, chordate, meaning that the notochord goes right to where the head should be, right? That's kind of an apomorphic condition for them. There's no other chordate group that has a notochord that extends right to the very, very anterior at the tip of the animal, such that there's no room for a head. You'll notice that they have these little tentacle-like structures called cirri that they use to feed, and they just live buried in these little sediments with their head out, feeding away. Supposedly, the sediments at the bottom of Tampa Bay are like the most absolutely well-populated lancelet places on Earth. I heard that at one point, and I didn't know until I came down here. But so supposedly the sediments of Tampa Bay are absolutely covered with these little lancelets. But like I said, I have preserved ones for you to look at up in lab. Okay, y'all know what a lancelet is? The genus for this lancelet is Amphiopsis. So that'll be one of the little names you'll learn in lab tonight. Okay, ready for Urochordates? Urochordates are slightly more interesting. Usually when we go to the moat, you'll see probably about 4 or 5 species of these. There's one kind of ugly one that people pull up under, like if you go fishing or something and you pull up sediments on the bottom. It looks kind of like a big gnarly potato, you know what I'm talking about? And it has little siphons on it like this, will squirt water out at you. You know what I'm talking about? The common name for these are sea squirts. There's one that's called a sea peach. Tunicates or ascidians is another common name. These have received a lot of attention recently because there are some really promising anti-cancer drugs that are being developed from these. The reason they are called tunicates is because the adults have this thick outer layer, which is like a tunic or like a coat that they're wearing. When you look at this, a very simple little animal. It has 2 little siphons. One's in current, the water comes in. One's excurrent, the water goes out. They have a gill that forms almost like a net, and little particles of food are filtered out of the water as it moves across that gill. The animal is sessile. It's benthic. What does that mean?
It's grounded.
It sits on the bottom and it's attached. It lives in one spot. If I had asked you a few weeks ago who's your closest invertebrate relative, you probably would not have picked this. Sort of almost looks like a sponge or something, right? Just sits in one spot. It's just filtering water. There's no head, there's no tail, there's no nothing, right? Certainly it's not a vertebrate, right? It has no head, has no tail. It does have this pharyngeal gill bag that's inside of it. It has no notochord. It has no nerve cord as an adult. If you were to look at a baby one, the baby one's actually called a tadpole, and you would see that it has a notochord, nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a tail. And remember, the rule is, as long as you have them at any point in development, it counts. You're a chordate. This is a perfectly good chordate. This is your closest invertebrate relative. It's in the same phylum with you, right? It's more closely related to you than a starfish would be. But if I had asked you, like, okay, between a grasshopper and, I don't know, a grasshopper, a snail, a starfish, and this thing, which one is most closely related to you? Most of you probably would not have picked this, right? It doesn't have a little head, doesn't have cute little eyes like a snail or a grasshopper would, right?
Is this, because I was looking at the book and they completely labeled it out completely different.
Yeah, so I got one here, huh?
Kind of
Is
confused on
that
how.
what you mean?
No, like all the names, all the names that you had, like on a couple slides ago where you're showing everything.
So this one, though, is just, I'm not breaking it down any more than chordates. So you'll see the first subgroup within chordates, the first big subgroup, nested monophyletic subgroup that we're going to look at, is going to be craniates, and we're not there yet.
Yeah, I'm just really, never mind.
So this one, you just know it's in the phylum Chordata, it's in the class, if you want to call it that, Urochordata, or you just say the clade Urochordata if you want to.
What does Euro mean?
With respect to this, I'm not sure. Let me look it up, that's good. Let me look it up.
Because that helps, like, when you talk about, like, what
Right,
does
to
the
remember.
actual meanings mean, it's really
Right.
good when connecting pictures.
Right, no, I agree.
And do
Let
you
me
know
look
why
at
it's
it.
called a tadpole? Like, I mean, kind of
Because it looks like a little tadpole, like a frog tadpole. Not
like, is that the
obviously.
actual name for it? Like,
That's what they're commonly called. They're called tadpoles. You'll see on the slides that you have upstairs, it says Ascidian tadpoles.
Because I didn't know if that was like a generic name for that, like, kind of feature or not.
It's a generic name for, so interestingly, I bet you Euro means without somehow. And you want to know why I'm getting that? Because you're going to see in a second when we get to amphibians, as soon as we start talking about frogs and tadpoles, the order for frogs, no, that's a neuron. Urodela is the order for salamanders, non-back. I don't know. Let's look it up. Yeah, I'm already back. I already messed myself up. I was thinking Urodela was frogs. It's not. Anura are frogs, Urodela is salamanders and newts. So Uro, that same Uro and Urodela in the order name for newts and salamanders is probably what this Uro is. I'll bring my little dictionary if I can remember this.
Wikipedia says Urochord says Urochordata means having a tail.
Which it does as a juvenile. It says just Uro means having a
It
tail?
says Uro, as in Urochordata means having a tail.
Okay. And that would make sense, because salamanders and newts have a tail. Frogs don't have a tail. Yeah, so Urodela are salamanders and newts. Neura, which probably means without a tail, is frogs and toads. Yeah. So this means Urochordata means a chordate having a tail. And it must be referring to this tail here. Because clearly as an adult, it doesn't have tail. So it's referring to the tail. So Uro means tail. That word. That kind of makes sense. I'm not sure that's the name I would pick. That's the name they pick. So it clearly has a tail as a juvenile. You can see by the time it gets to an adult, so notice here you have the pharynx, right, with the gill slits, and you have it here.
Did you get that stuff over there?
I'm gonna go tomorrow, because nobody else is going. So it's gonna be you and me, and I gotta come by here and get the stuff, but if you come, that'd be good. Just meet me there about 7 o'clock. No, seriously, do that. Because I know everything is upstairs, I'm gonna have to come by here tomorrow. I was gonna call you, yeah, no. You came all the way here to get it?
Well, I came up here to see if you did it.
You did what?
Took it over there.
No, it's all still here, but I'm gonna have to.
You sure you're gonna go tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm crazy. Yeah, no, because otherwise it'll be on.
Alright.
We're good.
Sorry, guys.
So notice that this has these pharyngeal gill slits here when it's a juvenile, but then it also has them as an adult, but that's the only one of the 48 features that it's keeping, right? So if you look at like a nerve cord, notochord, right, tail, they're gone by the time you get to the adult, right? Those features are not there, but it doesn't matter because it still has them as a juvenile, it's all has to have an order to qualify. Are we all kind of okay with that? And apparently urochordata means tailed chordate, which must be referring to this tail, because this guy doesn't have one. There's no tail there. I've done this before in an exam. I delete all the words and go copy, paste. I expect you to fill in some of the words. Not all of them. Could you get most of them? Like, could you get pharyngeal gill slits here? Could you get maybe tail, notochord, nerve cord, pharyngeal gills? You don't need to have all the rest of the stuff. But could you get that much at least? The key chordate features? Maybe, no. I wouldn't expect you to have every little detail there, but the key major things, yeah?
When it points to the notochord, is that the darker brown?
Right.
I'm trying to like.
And you'll notice it's slightly ventral. So the nerve cord is actually more dorsal than the notochord is. You're going to see this. You realize I have these upstairs for you to look at, prepared slides of them. And so you're going to look at them in cross section. You'll see, like you'll have that amphioxus, that little lancet. You'll look at it in cross section like this, and you'll see the nerve cord up here and the notochord right here. You'll see it. It'll be slightly better after lab tonight because you'll see it in lab. Okay, so we did cephalochordates and urochordates. Are we good with that? Kind of, sort of, maybe. Okay, so now we go to Mixini. And I don't know what Mixini means, so we'll look it up. This is the class or the group that includes what we call hagfish. These are agnaphans in the sense that they do not have jaws. So these historically would have been put in the class Agnatha. We're not using the class Agnatha
They're
anymore
showing
because it's not
these as the
modified.
oldest one, the furthest one back.
They're showing which one?
The
Urochordates.
The Myaxine.
Mixini.
Yeah, they're showing this as the most ancestral one.
More than urochordates and cephalochordates?
Yeah, they're saying it's this one and then the heterosome.
What book is that?
This is the
Brooker.
Brooker.
Show it to
And
me
then,
afterwards.
like, the most recent one would be the males.
Right, we're working our way down the map.
Yeah, but it's like completely, everything is
Show it to me
different, so I'm
afterwards.
just like really.
Show it to me afterwards and let me see how far off it is. But it should, cephalochordates and urochordates, those might be swapped. I've seen trees that have urochordates to the outside of cephalochordates. Have urochordates as the most basal of the chordate group, but not Mixini to the outside of that. So I'll look at it. Okay, so these guys historically would have been in the group of jawless fishes. They don't have jaws. They're scavengers. Remember how we said that there's some hermaphroditic chordates? They're in this group, right? Otherwise, chordates are separate sexes. These are scavengers. Typically what they do, I have a couple little movies I'm going to show you in the lab. These are the last movies I'm going to show you. They feed on like dead whale carcasses and things like that. They actually stick their head in and basically they wrap their body in a little knot and can rip chunks of flesh out even though they don't have any jaws to really grasp it. They just basically put their mouth on it and then tear the flesh out. You'll notice they're very flexible. These guys are craniates. Did you notice the two guys before now didn't have a head? Everybody after this now has a head, right? So Mixini, Petromyzontida, all of the fish, and the reptiles, birds, mammals, everybody has a head. There's no such thing as like headless birds, right? Have you ever seen a headless bird? They're not one that lives very long, right? So everybody's going to have a head. So we're all inside of now this group that we're going to call craniates, whether it's a subphylum or whatever within Chordata. And this is a specific group, Mixini, that includes the hagfish, yeah? So they have a head, but they're technically invertebrates. They have a notochord, but it doesn't develop into a vertical column. That's part of why they have this kind of very extreme flexibility. One of the interesting things that they have that others other fish, other chordates don't have are these slime glands that produce this just crazy mucus that when it hits water, it expands and makes just copious amounts of snot. The common name for these is slime eels because they make all this slime, but they're not eels, you realize. Eels are bony fish, so these are definitely not eels. I have a movie, it's a movie a student brought to me a couple of years ago. It's the Dirty Jobs thing. You guys haven't seen that program? Where he's on a ship harvesting slime eels, and so you'll see them make all this tons and tons of slime. Apparently they eat them in Korea, that's why they're harvesting them. But they have to try to get the slime away from them, and it's incredible.
I think that's where like Mixini comes from, because looking it up, it's kind of close to slime in
Okay.
Greek, because it's like coming from Yuxa, but it's like tying that to Yuxa, which
That makes
means
perfect
slime,
sense.
so.
Okay, does that make it easier to remember
It's a side
Maxine?
comment, so.
Kind of like, sounds like mucus, sort of kind of, yeah, that's good, that's good. As we go through these, you can look them up. Petromyzontidae, I'm not gonna know what it means either. Here's a link to a little movie on hagfish, but I'll show you that in the lab. Okay, so the other group of jawless fishes, right, besides the hagfish, are these things called lampreys. And the lampreys, you'll see they have these teeth, right? Those are all little teeth in there, but they're no jaws, right? So they don't close their mouth. Here's one inside view. I kind of like this one because it looks like they're singing in a choir or something. Fishermen don't like these because these, unlike hagfish that are scavengers, these guys actually attach to a fish and suck blood out of it. So they're sort of long-lived parasites on fish, really, if you could think of them that way. You'll notice that these guys do have a notochord that develops into a vertebral column. So these are vertebrates now. So they're not only craniates with a head, but they're also vertebrates in the sense that they have a vertebral column. Anybody quickly look up what that refers to? Petra. Petra, that almost sounds like rock to me, right? Petra or Peter means rock. This I have no idea. Somebody can be clever and see if they can figure out what that word means. Common name would be lampreys, right, on these guys. So historically, lampreys and hagfish would have been put together as ignathids. So this shows a hagfish has these 12 gill slits. If you look at a lamprey, it has 7 gill openings. We have a little model of a lamprey up in the lab that you'll see, and then I also have some little prepared slides. And there's even the head of a real lamprey that's in one of those little boxes with preservatives, so you'll get to kind of see this a little bit. So in a second here, we're going to move from things that don't have jaws to things that do have jaws, right? So everybody in just a second is going to have jaws. All of the cartilaginous fish, which includes things like sharks, clearly have jaws, right? And things like all the bony fish, all the amphibians, reptiles, everybody, birds and mammals all have jaws. And you might ask, well, what is the origin of the jaws? And it ends up that your jaw bones are actually homologous to the skeletal rods that separate these gill openings in something like a lamprey. Believe it or not, that's where the bones are derived from. And so it shows it here. If this is sort of like some kind of an early jawless fish, and you'll notice these are the gill openings. And if you look at these 3rd and 4th skeletal rods that run between the gill openings, that these actually are homologous to the bones that make up the jaw, the maxillary and mandibular arches of the jaw. You'll see something very interesting when we get to mammals. There are 2 bones that are actually forming the jaw joint in diapsids and things like reptiles and birds, called the articular and the quadrate. It ends up that in mammals have a different jaw joint. Your jaw joint is further forward. Have you ever noticed if you look at like a crocodile's jaw like this, the hinge is way back here? And if you look at something like a dog or a deer or something like that, the hinge is further forward. And the jaw joint is actually formed between the dentary and, I think it's the squamosal, but it's not formed between the articular and the quadrate. And so what happens is those 2 bones have been freed up, they've migrated into the inner ear, and they actually form the incus and the malleus inside of the inner ear of mammals. That 3 inner ear bones, stapes, incus, and malleus. Stapes, incus, and malleus is a hallmark mammalian character. You probably didn't think part of your ear came out of your jaw, but from an evolutionary point of view, it did. This is a placoderm. It's a very early gnathostome, right? So clearly it has jaws. So if you wanted to kind of imagine what an early jawed fish would have looked like, this is an example of one. Notice that scale bar is a ½ meter. This thing is huge. They had one of these at the Field Museum. It's like, what is that, 2 meters tall or something? These are really, really huge jawed fish. Okay, so let's look at some of the guys with jaws. So these are chordates. They're in the phylum Chordata, right? It means they have a notochord, neurochord, gill slits, and a tail. They're craniates, which means they're a part of the chordates that have a head. Within the craniates, they're vertebrates. What does that mean? Their notochord becomes a vertebral column, right? They're gnathostomes, which means that they have jaws. And specifically, this is a group called the chondrichthyans. Ichthy means fish. So I don't know what chond means, but the common name for this group is cartilaginous fish. So maybe somebody can see what chond or chondra means.
I think
Does
it
it mean
does
cartilage?
mean cartilage.
Okay, okay, good. That would be great. Because the common name for this group is cartilaginous fish, and that's actually what the name means. Okay, so this is going to be who? It's going to be the sharks, rays, and skates. Yeah? And you'll see a lot of these when we go to Moke. There's a whale shark here, right, which is a shark, not a whale. These guys have a lot of differences with bony fish, right? So, for example, you'll see one of the characters of a bony fish is that they have a swim bladder. These guys don't. They can't maintain buoyancy in the water, so you'll notice that they swim constantly, right? Like, you know how your little goldfish will sit there and he'll look at you like this, he's sitting with, you don't see sharks doing that, right? Sharks move constantly. If you look at the rays that are at Moke, you'll see that they keep moving constantly, right? They also have different types of scales. If you look at the scales on most fish, they're these bony scales. These guys have these little placoid scales. It makes it feel kind of like sandpaper when you rub them. They have little teeth on them. We have prepared slides with placoid scales for you to look at upstairs. They also, and I know this is going to come up, there's a table that you're supposed, or it's a large phylogeny that you're filling all these characters in. I can never remember, but there's a derived character, I think it's for the actinopterygons or something. If you look at the bony fish, you'll notice that their caudal fin, their tail, is symmetrical. Whoops, which I'm not drawing there. Yeah? But if you look at something like a shark, you know how the caudal fin is asymmetrical, right? It's like really big on one side. I've obviously really exaggerated it there. But if you look at a shark's, which is here, like here, right? It's not symmetrical, whereas it is in bony fish. These guys also have really interesting sensory systems, right? So they're able to detect like electrical impulses in water using this system of canals that they have. They're very hypersensitive to different types of stimuli in the environment. This allows them to trap prey. Yeah, you're going to see a lot of these. You realize Jenny Clark, who's a major shark research person, founded Moke, and so they have a lot of sharks and shark-related things at Moke that you'll see. Okay, ready? So here we go. Now I know it's showing you these three, but we're going to kind of do them one by one. These three together would have historically been the osteichthyes, or the bony fish, right? This is going to be most of the fish that you know. So this shows you some of the anatomy, right? Here you can see some of the key chordate features, things like pharyngeal gill slits and a dorsal spinal cord, right? Has a tail, right? A post-anal tail. So you can see some key chordate features here. The one I think I'd rather you really focus in on is this idea of a swim bladder. So a swim bladder in a fish, in a bony fish, believe it or not, is homologous to your lung. You use your lungs for gas exchange. Obviously, this fish uses its gills for gas exchange, right? Because it's exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and water, not between blood and air, so it doesn't need lungs. But this swim bladder, this structure, is actually homologous to your lung. And in the case of the fish, it's using it to regulate buoyancy. It can either increase the amount of air that's in the swim bladder or decrease it in order to make itself buoyant within the water column. It'd be good if you started trying to learn the names. We're going to do a lot of that next week when we go to Moke, right? But the names of the fins. So hopefully you can tell a dorsal fin from a pectoral fin, from a pelvic fin, from a caudal fin. Are you guys good with that or no? Learn those a little bit. If not, you'll know them when we go to Moke, because next week you're going to be trying to classify different body types for fish, and then part of it's going to have to do with talking about what part of the body is moving. Is it moving its caudal fin? Is it moving its pectoral fins? What part of the fish is involved in the movement? So you'll get good at that. Okay, so here we are. We're chordates. These are craniates. They all have a head. Within craniates, they're vertebrates. The notochord becomes a vertebral column. They're gnathostomes. They have jaws. They're osteichthyans, which means bony fish, right? So they have an ossified skeleton, not a cartilaginous skeleton. And they're in this group called Actinopterygii, which is a subgroup of osteichthyan fish that includes virtually all of the teleost fish, so all of the fish that you would know. So I'll tell you right now, if I said, I want you to name 100 fish, you can't say hagfish, lamprey, shark, skate, ray, lungfish, or coelacanth. But I want you to name 100 other fish. You just can't say those 7. You're going to name 100 Actinopterygian osteichthyan bony fish. The common name for actinopterygians are ray-finned fish because they do not have skeletal elements that extend beyond the body wall other than these little bony rays. So they have little bony rays that extend into their fins, but they don't have major skeletal elements that extend beyond the body wall. So you don't have like what look like arm bones going into their fins, right? Instead, you just have these little bony rays. So the common name for actinopterygians would be ray-finned fish. We're going to contrast this with a group of Osteichthyine fish called lobe-finned fish. Those are things like lungfish and coelacanth that actually have skeletal elements, major skeletal elements that extend beyond the body wall into their fins, right? So, but as I mentioned, most of the things that you call fish, right, are these, are ray-finned fish. So everything from tuna, goldfish, cardinal tetra, this is a salmon, convict cichlid, eels, this is where eels go. Hagfish are not these, right? Hagfish don't have a vertebral column, they certainly don't have a bony skeleton, they're not eels, right? Seahorses are not horses. They're ray-finned fish, Nemo, right? All these guys you know, all these fish you know, perch, mackerel, sardines. I mean, start naming fish. Just name every fish you could think of. Except for sharks, rays, and skates, which are convictine fish, lampreys and hagfish, which are jawless fish, right? Coelacanth and lungfish, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Every other fish you could name would be one of these guys.
Is that the scientific? It's not Nemo, is it? It's clownfish.
Well, it's an anemone fish or
Oh,
clownfish.
oh.
Yeah.
I thought so.
Most people. So you'll see when we go to moat, moat largely has only animals that live here, right, that are Floridian or live close by. There are some exceptions. There's some convict fish there. The reason they have convict fish is because Eugenie Clark studies them, because she runs moat, but they're actually from the Indian Ocean or something, they're far away. They do have clownfish. They have little surgeonfish. The reason is because all the kids used to come in and say, "Where's Nemo? Where's Dory?" These are like Indo-Pacific though or something. They don't belong here. They have a tank with a couple of them so all the kids can see Nemo and Dory. So there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, the animals you see at moat really are animals from around here. That's part of the reason I like going there, because they really are animals that you would know from around here. So here's this phylogeny again. You're all going to kind of learn this, right? Let's go here. So which one of these chordates is an invertebrate? So remember, not all things in the phylum Chordata are vertebrates. Certainly the majority of them, especially the ones that we know well, are. But there's some invertebrate chordates too. So a hagfish, a lamprey, a gnathostome, well, that's not even a specific animal, right? That's a whole group of animals. Or a tetrapod, again, that's a whole group of animals, not a specific one. Remember, I'm going to throw all these names at you, right? I'm going to throw you 20 names. You guys are all going to give me a picture in your head, right? So if I said gnathostome, could you name one? Can you name one? Throw me a gnathostome. Shark, that'd be good. What else could you say? Stingray. What else could you say? Gnathostomes is skate, but you're talking about just convicting. How about you? Tiger. A bear. A penguin. Nemo. Anybody with jaws, right? There's like hundreds of right answers you could have. You're all going to say the right answer, right? The right answer is any animal that falls into that group of jawed vertebrates. Okay, is that everybody? 13? Are there all 13? Is that everybody? Not Joel.
Get new batteries.
Well, what about others? Is that everybody then? 14? Keep trying.
Oh, they're all under the same thing. Oh, of course.
Finally died.
Which one is, for which one is
Okay.
it invertebrate?
All right, so a hagfish, remember, right, it's a cranium, but not a vertebrate, right? But the others all are. All the gnathostomes and tetrapods would be as well as a lamprey. Okay, so how about it? All chordates have what? A head, a tail, a chambered heart, or bones. Go back to thinking about what makes a chordate a chordate. Y'all know what makes a chordate a chordate? There's like 4 things. Okay, that's all we had last time. That's it, right? Tail, right? Notochord, nerve cord, gill slits, and a tail. You don't have to have a head. Lancelets don't have a head. Tunicates don't have a head. How about which one of these has a lung? Even though maybe it doesn't really use it as a lung, but it has a lung, meaning a structure that's homologous to a lung. So a shark, a salmon, a tunicate, or a stingray. You're probably sitting here going, wow, I thought they all had gills. They do, right? They do have gills, but one of them has a structure that's homologous to a lung. Doesn't mean they use it to breathe, right? Is there one more? That's everybody.
Wait. It's not going to?
Yeah?
It's not going on, but go for it.
Is it, were you going to do change?
I was
You're in there, aren't you?
no. Oh, there you go.
Okay, so salmon, right, is an Ostictian fish, right? The others are, well, tunicate, of course, is not anywhere in there, right? It's much further up in the tree, but sharks and stingrays are both constricting fish, they don't have a swim line. Okay, so which of the following is likely to be a real group? What does real group mean? Monophyletic. So jawless fish, lobe-finned fish, ray-finned fish, or if you think all of them, let's see, what would it be? None of them are likely to be a real group, then you pick D. What's the name that used to be used for jawless fish? Do you remember? Echinaptons. And how about lobe-finned fish? Sarcopterygii. And what's the name for ray-finned fish? Actinopterygii. There's only one of those 3 that I used, or I didn't use any of those 3 in the new scheme. Did you see the word agnathan anywhere? In the new scheme, in that new tree? Did you see the word Sarcopterygii anywhere? Did you see the word Actinopterygii in there anywhere? You best saw one of those 3, or maybe you didn't see any of those 3 words, in which case D is the right answer.
What's an example of a lobe-finned fish again?
A lungfish or coelacanth, I'm going to show them to you in a second.
No.
As historically defined, in the new definition, you're a lobe-finned fish.
Thank you.
That kind of gives the answer away, right? Or at least in part. Okay, are we all there now? There's one more, isn't there? And Joel came alive from that. You found your battery.
Shake it the wrong way, it turns off, it's like loose, it's got a couple things in it.
Okay, that's good. Okay, kind of all over the place, right? So Actinopterygii is still in there, isn't it? I just gave you that as the name for that group of all the ray-finned fish, right? Sarcopterygii I'm not using though. Why did you guys pick this? I did use the word Actinopterygii, didn't I? Ray-finned fish is a monophyletic group, presumably, even as sort of as historically defined it is. Ostictes is not, but Actinopterygii.